Yeah.
You know,
Well, I think everyone remembers the time when, if you challenged the official narrative on COVID, if you
mm,
even used phrases like natural immunity,
mm,
lab leak, mentioned Sweden, you were in danger of getting deplatformed, shadow banned, cancelled, all of the
mm.
above.
I know.
And it was an absolute, there was a climate of fear about this, an
Mm,
absolute shutting down of any open and honest debate about COVID, whether it was the origins of COVID, lab leak versus zoonotic emergence, or whether it was a discussion about the mitigation strategies.
mm,
But an official narrative arose,
mm,
which was essentially everyone's at risk, we've got to shut down the world. Any dissenting voices, including dissenting voices from the scientific community, from
mm,
doctors, medics, epidemiologists,
mm.
virologists, whoever it was, was just brutally shut down, and it was like, no, no, we can't have that. So, for example, one of the things that was very quickly apparent was that while everyone was at risk of catching COVID because it was so transmissible,
Mm,
most people were at no risk of a serious health outcome.
mm,
It was almost immediately clear that three groups of people were
mm,
at risk,
mm,
and really only three: the elderly,
mm,
and I'm talking generally sort of
mm,
75, 80 plus, the immunocompromised,
mm,
and the obese.
mm,
But instead of targeting resources
mm.
and help at those people and protecting those people who were genuinely at risk, this false everyone's in danger narrative was promoted and took hold, and they shut down the world.
Yeah, I mean, like you point out in the film, the effects of the lockdowns and the mask man. I mean, the science was very, very flaky
The
at best,
science
wasn't
was the science was very, very weak. There had been no real peer-reviewed studies on the effectiveness of masks, particularly cloth masks that everyone wore, not even properly wore.
it? Mm,
And when studies were done, such as the Danish mask study, they were dishonestly smeared as being sort of right-wing propaganda.
mm,
Everything that countered the narrative was dishonestly smeared as being a right-wing dog whistle,
mm,
and you called a conspiracy theorist or a far right, which is a phrase thrown mindlessly at anyone questioning certain narratives these days. But on masks, the science was very, very weak. And then when, as I say, we got things like the Danish mask study,
mm,
that was just, oh no, we're not interested in looking at that. And then later on in
mm.
the pandemic, the Cochrane Institute meta-analysis really conclusively showed that cloth masks had only a statistically insignificant um, effect on lowering both community spread and mortality rates. And then, of course, in the UK, the Department of Education commissioned a study, found exactly the same thing: cloth masks, statistically insignificant health benefits, and used that finally,
Mm.
far too late in the day, but finally to unmask kids in schools. But people were saying follow the science. And when the science actually came in and said, look, this doesn't work, they weren't interested. Same with lockdowns.
Mm,
The Joseph Rowntree Foundation in the
mm,
UK produced a very comprehensive
mm,
report on this. Again, showing minimal effect, statistically insignificant effect on things like community spread and mortality rates,
mm,
yet a huge socioeconomic um,
mm,
impact, negative impact. And of course, they pointed out what a lot of people didn't like to say: this disproportionately, the brutal mandates
mm,
disproportionately hit the poor and the working class. The
mm,
laptop class were fine. They just carried on doing meetings via Zoom in their pajamas. But the working class and people in the gig economy, particularly, were absolutely hammered by this.
Mm.
And the media must take a fair degree of responsibility. I mean, I know it's the old saying, of course, well, two old sayings, the Hollywood saying, fear sells, and the
Mm.
old newspaper saying, if it bleeds, it leads. Well,
Mm.
this was a gift for the media in the early days. I'm sure people remember some of the anecdotes, like a mother and her children struck down by COVID. It's only when you read beyond the headline you found out these children were in their 50s or 60s. Tragic, of course, for the people involved,
Mm.
but it was a false narrative, and we've never had
Mm.
a real reckoning about this. The UK inquiries the UK inquiries focused on things like Partygate. The real message, the real story of Partygate. I mean, yes, it was rules for thee and not for me, and
Yeah.
that's always frustrating. But the real take-home message from Partygate should have been this: look, the people best briefed on the threat
Mm.
are so unworried about this that they're just mingling, not socially distanced, not masked. What does that tell us about COVID? What it tells us is they know, as everyone should have known fairly quickly, that for most people this is going to be asymptomatic or very mild. And
Mm.
and yeah, we should have targeted the help and the resources at the genuinely vulnerable, not shut down the world in in a move that frankly cost lots of people their jobs, their businesses
Mm.
that they worked hard for years to establish and hold
Mm.
down.
Mm.
It cost trillions of pounds, of course. I mean, if you're looking at this globally, trillions and trillions.
Mm.
It set civil liberties back at least a generation, I would say. Brutal. And of course, as we now know, and knew fairly quickly if we'd really studied it,
Mm.
ineffective mandates on school closures, vaccines, lockdowns, masks, and and yet the answers were there if people looked for them hard enough. I mean, the New York Times in the United States, often regarded as the US's newspaper of record,
Mm.
did a piece on schools, and they said that statistically, a child was more likely to die in a car crash on the way to school
Remember that.
than of COVID caught at school.
Mm.
And then we get into, people say, oh, but it's not about those at risk. What about the spread? Well, things like the vaccine mandates
Mm.
were being imposed on people long, long after it was shown that the vaccine didn't stop transmission. So again,
Mm.
completely false narratives. And so that's why I made this film. Really, two reasons. Firstly, historical accuracy. The truth matters.
Mm.
And people, generally speaking, don't really know the truth of this. I think there's this uncomfortable awareness in most people's minds that they were kind of suckered into this and
Mm.
conned. And
Mm.
when people ask themselves, do I actually know a whole load of people who died from this?
Mm.
And I think in my social circle, I knew one person who I didn't even know personally. They were sort of 90-plus-year-old person who had kidney problems, who lived in my in-laws' apartment plot.
Mm.
And I think if people ask around, there's this sort of growing, wait a minute, realization, but out of a mix of
Mm.
embarrassment and just out of a desire not to get dragged into the fact that you had 2 to 3 years of your life stolen. People are just prepared to put it in the rearview mirror. Well, I'm not. And like I say, because the truth matters. And I think the other point is that those people who made these decisions, sometimes because they panicked,
Mhm.
um, but sometimes clearly some of the decisions were bad faith decisions. The virus was very quickly politicized,
mm,
which was a huge mistake, and it became, particularly in the US, the authoritarian the
mm,
authoritarian left
mm,
used it as a sort of control mechanism. And when anyone sort of a more conservative or libertarian perspective said, but wait a minute, you're telling us to follow the science. Here is the science. They just didn't want to listen. So there's a whole
mm,
mix of things that led me to make this film. Desire to set the record straight and tell the true story of what happened.
mm,
You know, historical accuracy, the truth matters.
mm.
Desire that we should have an open and honest conversation and hold to account those people who did make bad calls, whether it was in good faith or not.
Mm.
If it was in good faith, well, let's learn the lessons. And if it was in bad faith, yeah, absolutely. People like that should be fired if they're still in positions of power and authority. But the third and most important reason, I alluded to learning the lessons, there will be another pandemic.
Mm.
It is only a matter of time before, whether it's bird flu or whether it's a mutation of Ebola or whether it's Nipah virus.
Mm.
And it doesn't even matter whether it's lab leak or natural zoonotic emergence. It probably is only a matter of time. And if we don't learn the lessons of the failed response to COVID, all that's going to happen when the next pandemic hits is we're going to repeat the same mistakes. We're going to roll out the same now discredited um, health mitigation strategies like masks and lockdowns and vaccine mandates and school and business closures. And that's going to be a terrible thing. And the other thing about all this is public trust in healthcare,
Mhm.
in public health authorities and things
Mhm.
is absolutely shattered.
Mm.
And so let's suppose we get a bird flu pandemic, and very quickly we do get a very good vaccine
Mm.
that really does work. People will be suspicious of it
Mm.
because they will be saying to themselves, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Good point.
And yet, next time around, the vaccine might be good. I mean, actually, with COVID, I still say
Mm.
if people were in those vulnerable groups, the elderly, the immunocompromised, and the obese, it was probably worth them taking the vaccine. Um, but if you were anyone else, it
Mm.
was just a waste of time and money. It
Yeah.
didn't stop transmission. And the mandates were, as I say, from a civil liberties point of view, absolutely brutal. I mean, we've just fortunately had President Trump reinstated 8,000 people in the military
Yeah.
who were fired for refusing to take the vaccine. These were young, fit, healthy men and women who were at virtually zero risk of getting anything more than a cold.
Mm.
And yet they were treated like dirt. They were vilified. I mean, the phrase, as I'm sure people can remember, the phrase "the unvaccinated" was was used with a sort of sneering hatred, and people were denied, basic human rights. There's got to be some accountability for that.
Absolutely. I mean, well done for making this film. Where can people see it? It's called Apocalypse COVID. Where can we watch it?
Well, that's an interesting question. It is on Amazon and I think Amazon Prime, Amazon.com.
Mhm.
The filmmakers and the distributors are struggling to get it on to some of the Amazon territories,
Really?
Amazon.uk,
Uh,
Australia, Canada.
Okay.
Obviously, there is still some institutional nervousness about COVID and about telling the true story of what was
Mhm.
done to us.
Mhm.
And I think that obviously some very powerful people and institutions are rather nervous about all this, as well they might be.
Mhm.
And so we are having a bit of a struggle. Actually, the film got its world premiere
Mm,
at Peter Thiel's Hereticon
mm,
in Miami at the end of last year.
mm.
Now, Peter Thiel obviously has the power
Yep.
that he's not going to cave in to this sort of institutional censorship,
Mm,
and so I was honored and delighted that the film was given its world premiere at Hereticon.
mm.
And um,
Okay.
as for the rest, as for the other platforms,
Mm,
we will see. The filmmaker, the distributor are working hard, but there is nervousness. There are some people who still say, "Oh, this is conspiracy material." It's not. At every
oh
single
no.
point in the film, I cite
Mm,
the I cite scientific studies,
mm.
papers that have been published in the Lancet.
It's very well
Uh,
researched. No, definitely, it's not conspiracy. I've seen a lot of conspiracy films, and this is not a conspiracy film.
no, and
Mm,
I was very careful for
mm,
precisely this reason that every time I made a statement, whether it was about the closures of businesses or schools, vaccine mandate,
mm,
lockdowns,
mm,
masks, lab leak versus community spread, I was very careful to cite the name of the publication
mm,
and the scientific journal or academic um, journal that it was published in, the date of the study, so that people could fact check this for themselves. And for example, just on lab leak, again, lab leak was treated, the phrase itself was treated as a right wing
mm,
dog whistle. If you now go to the website of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in the UK, in the US, you
mm,
will find that
mm,
of the 18 parts of the US intelligence community, some think it was lab leak, some think it was zoonotic emergence, some aren't sure. CIA just a few days ago revised their assessment. And this was not a Trump initiative. This was actually instituted under the Biden
mm,
administration. So it's not political, and CIA now come down more on the side of lab leak. And
mm.
yet some people who still don't realize that slowly all the things we were told about COVID are unraveling.
I know. And well done for bringing it to our attention.